All right, guys, Free to Choose, Chapter 7. Free to Choose, Chapter 7, Who Protects the Consumer? This is pretty long. This one's called the Interstate Commerce Commission. It's about 9 pages. Don't want to read it all. Maybe I might break it up. Let's see. The Interstate Commerce Commission. Chapter 7, Free to Choose, Who Protects the Consumer? The Civil War was followed by an unprecedented expansion of the railroads, symbolized by the driving of the Golden Spike at Promontory Point, Utah on May 10, 1869. To mark the joining of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads, completing the first transcontinental line, soon there was a second, third, and even fourth transcontinental route. In 1865, railroads already operated 35,000 miles of track. 10 years later, close to 75,000, and by 1885, over 125,000. By 1890, there were more than 1,000 separate railroads. The country was literally crisscrossed with railroads going to every remote hamlet and covering the nation from coast to coast. The miles of track in the United States exceeded that and all the rest of the world combined. Competition was fierce. As a result, freight and passenger rates were low, supposedly the lowest in the world. Railroad men, of course, complained of cutthroat competition. Every time the economy faltered in one of its periodic slumps, railroads went bankrupt and were taken over by others or simply went out of business. When the economy revived, another surge of railroad construction followed. The railroad men of the time tried to improve their position by joining together, forming pools, agreeing to fix rates at profitable levels, and to divide the market. To their dismay, the agreements were always breaking down so long as the rest of the members of a pool kept up their rates. At any one member could benefit by cutting his rates and taking business away from the others. Of course, he would not cut rates openly. He would do so in devious ways to keep the other members of the pool in the dark as long as possible. Hence, such practices arose as secret rebates to favored shippers and discriminatory pricing between regions or commodities. Sooner or later, the price cutting would become known and the pool would collapse. Competition was fiercest between distant, populous points such as New York and Chicago. Shippers and passengers could choose among a number of alternate routes operated by different railroads, and also among the canals that had earlier covered the land. On the other hand, between shorter segments of any one of these routes, for example, between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, there might be only one railroad. That railroad would have something of a monopoly position, subject only to competition from alternative means of transport, such as canals or rivers. Naturally, it would take full advantage of its monopoly position wherever it could and charge all that the traffic would bear. One result was that the sum of the fares charged for the short hauls, or even for one short haul, was sometimes larger than the total sum charged for the long haul between the two distant points. Of course, none of the consumers complained about the low prices for the long haul, but they certainly did complain about the higher prices for the short hauls. Similarly, the favored shippers who got rebates in the secret rate-cutting wars did not complain, but those who failed to get rebates were loud in their complaints about discriminatory pricing. The railroads were the major enterprises of the day, highly visible, highly competitive, linked with Wall Street and the financial East. They were a steady source of stories of financial manipulation and skullduggery in high places. They became a natural target, particularly for the farmers of the Middle West. The Grange movement, which arose in the 1870s, attacked the monopolistic railroads. They were joined by the Greenback Party, the Farmers Alliance, and so on, all agitating frequently with success at the State House for government control of freight rates and practices. The Populist Party, through which William Jennings Bryan rose to fame, called not merely for regulation of the railroads, but for outright government ownership and operation. The cartoonists of the time had a field day depicting the railroads as octopuses strangling the country and exercising tremendous political influence, which indeed they did. As the campaign against the railroads mounted, some far-sighted railroad men recognized that they could turn it to their advantage, that they could use the federal government to enforce their price fixing and market sharing agreements, and to protect themselves from state and local governments. They joined the reformers in supporting government regulation. The outcome was the establishment of the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887. It took about a decade to get the commission in full operation. By that time, the reformers had moved on to the next crusade. The railroads were only one of their concerns. They had achieved their objective. and they had no overpowering interest to lead them to do more than cast an occasional glance at what the ICC was doing. For the railroad men, the situation was entirely different. The railroads were their business, their overriding concern. They were prepared to spend 24 hours a day on it, and who else had the expertise to staff and run the IIC or the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission? They soon learned how to use the commission to their advantage. The first commissioner was Thomas Cooley, a lawyer who had represented the railroads for many years. He and his associates sought greater regulatory power from Congress, and that power was granted as President Cleveland's Attorney General Richard J. Olney put it in a letter to railroad tycoon Charles E. Perkins, president of the Burlington and Quincy Railroad, only a half dozen years after the establishment of ICC. This is what he said. The commission, as its function, have now been limited by the courts, is or can be made of great use to the railroads. It satisfies the popular clamor for a government supervision of railroads at the same time that the supervision is almost entirely nominal. Further, the older such a commission gets to be, the more inclined it will be found to take the business and railroad view of things. It thus becomes a sort of barrier between the railroad corporations and the people, and a sort of protection against hasty and crude legislation hostile to railroad interests. The part of wisdom is not to destroy the commission, but to utilize it. The commission solved the long haul, short haul problem. As you will not be surprised to learn, it did so mostly by raising the long haul rates to equal the sum of the short haul rates. Everybody except the customer was happy. As time passed, the commission's powers were increased, and it came to exercise closer and closer control over every aspect of the railroad business. In addition, power shifted from direct representatives of the railroads to growing ICC bureaucracy. However, that was no threat to the railroads. Many of the bureaucrats were drawn from the railroad industry. Their day-to-day business tended to be with railroad people, and their chief hope of a lucrative future career was with railroads. The real threat to the railroads arose in 1920s when trucks emerged as long-distance haulers. The artificially high freight rates maintained by the ICC for railroads enabled the trucking industry to grow by leaps and bounds. It was unregulated and highly competitive. Anybody with enough capital to buy a truck could go into the business. The principal argument used against the railroads in the campaign for government regulation, that they were monopolies that had to be controlled to keep them from exploiting the public, had no validity whatsoever for trucking. It would be hard to find an industry that came closer to satisfying the requirements for what the economists call perfect competition. But that did not stop the railroads from agitating to have long-distance trucking brought under the control of the Interstate Commerce Commission. And they succeeded. The Motor Carrier Act of 1935 gave the ICC jurisdiction over truckers to protect the railroads, not the consumers. The railroad story was repeated for trucking. It was cartelized, rates were fixed. It was cartelized or cartelized, so like cartelized. It became a cartel. It was cartelized. Rates were fixed, routes assigned. As the trucking industry grew, the representatives of the truckers came to have more and more influence on the commission and gradually came to replace railroad representatives as the dominant force. The ICC became as much an agency devoted to protecting the trucking industry from the railroads and the non-regulated trucks as to protecting the railroads against the trucks. With it all, there was an overlay of simply protecting its own bureaucracy. In order to operate as an interstate public carrier, a trucking company must have a certificate of public convenience and necessity issued by the ICC. Out of some of 89,000 initial applications for such certificates after the passage of the Motor Carrier Act of 1935, the ICC approved only about 27,000 out of 89,000. Since that time, the Commission has been very reluctant to grant new competitive authority. Moreover, mergers and failures of existing trucking firms have reduced the number of such firms from over 25,000 in 1939 to 15,000 in 1974. At the same time, the tons shipped by regulated trucks in inner city service have increased from 25.5 million in 1938 to 698 million in 1972, a 27-fold increase. The certificates can be bought and sold. The growth in traffic, the decline in number of firms, and the discouragement of rate competition by rate bureaus and ICC practices have increased the value of certificates considerably. Thomas More estimates that their aggregate value in 1972 was between 2 and 3 billion. a value that corresponds solely to a government-granted monopoly position. It constitutes wealth for the people who own the certificates, but for the society as a whole, it is a measure of the loss from government intervention, not a measure of productive capacity. Every study shows that the elimination of ICC regulation of trucking would drastically reduce costs to shippers. More estimates by perhaps as much as three-quarters. A trucking company in Ohio, Dayton Air Freight, offers a specific example. It has an ICC license that gives its exclusive permission to carry freight from Dayton to Detroit. To serve other routes, it has had to buy rights from ICC license holders, including one who doesn't own a single truck. It has paid as much as $100,000 a year for the privilege. The owners of the firm have been trying to get their license extended to cover more routes, so far without success. As one of their customers, Malcolm Richards, puts it, quite frankly, I don't know why the ICC is sitting on its hands doing nothing. This is the third time to my knowledge that we have supported the application of Dayton Air Freight to help us save money, help free enterprise, help the country save energy. It all comes down to the consumers ultimately going to pay for all this. One of the owners of Dayton Air Freight, Ted Hackler, adds, as far as I'm concerned, there was no free enterprise in interstate commerce. It no longer exists in this country. You have to pay the price, and you have to pay the price very dearly. And that not only means that we have to pay the price, it means the consumer is paying the price. The producer, it costs more for the producer to produce, so that he has to be able to make it make sense for him to even produce. So he needs to make money, so he needs to charge us more who consume his product. One of the owners of Dayton Air Freight, Ted Hacker, adds, as far as I'm concerned, there was no free enterprise. Okay, there we go. Already read that, right? Let's highlight all that. But this comment has to be taken with a real grain of salt in light of a comment by another owner, Herschel Wimmer. I have no argument with the people who already have ICC permits, accepting for the fact that this is a big country, and since the inception of the ICC in 1936, there have been few entrants into the business. They do not allow new entrants to come into the business and compete with those who are already in. We conjecture that this reflects a reaction we have encountered repeatedly among railroad men and truckers. Give us a certificate or grant us a waiver of the rules. Yes, abolish the issuance of certificates or the system of government regulation. No. In view of the vested interests that have grown up, that reaction is entirely understandable. To return to railroads, the ultimate effects of government intervention are not yet over. The increasingly rigid rules prevented railroads from adjusting effectively to the emergence of automobiles, buses, and planes as an alternative to railroads for long-distance passenger traffic. They once again turned to the government, this time by nationalization of passenger traffic in the form of Amtrak. The same process is occurring in freight. Much of the railroad freight trackage in the Northeast has in effect been nationalized through the creation of Conrail following the dramatic bankruptcy of the New York Central Railroad. That is very likely the prospect for the rest of the railroad industry as well. Air travel repeated the railroad and trucking story. When the Civil Aeronautics Board was established in 1938, it assumed control over 19 domestic trunk line carriers. Today, there are even fewer despite the enormous growth in air travel and despite numerous applications for certificates of public convenience and necessity. Certificates of public convenience and necessity. The airline story does differ in one important respect. For a variety of reasons, not least the successful price cutting across the Atlantic by Freddie Laker, the enterprising British owner of a major international airline, and the personality and ability of Alfred Kahn, former chairman of the CAB, there has recently been considerable deregulation of airfares, both administratively and legislatively. This is the first major move in any area away from government control and toward greater freedom. Its dramatic success, lower fares yet higher earnings for the airlines, has encouraged a movement towards some measure of deregulation of surface transportation. However, powerful forces, particularly in the trucking industry, are organizing opposition to such deregulation, so as yet it is only a faint hope. One ironic echo of the long haul, short haul issue recently arose in the air industry. In this case, the discrepancy was the opposite of that in rails. The short haul fare was the lower. The case occurred in California, which is a large enough state to support several major airlines that fly solely within the state, and as a result were not subject to cab control. Competition on the route between San Francisco and Los Angeles produced an interstate fare that was much lower than the fare that the cab permitted interstate lines to charge for the same trip. The irony is that a complaint was filed before the cab about the discrepancy in 1971 by Ralph Nader, self-proclaimed defender of the consumer. It so happens that one of Nader's subsidiaries had published an excellent analysis of the ICC, stressing, among other things, how the long-haul, short-haul discrimination was resolved. Nader could hardly have been under any illusions about how the airline case would be resolved, as any student of regulation would have predicted. The cab ruling, later upheld by the Supreme Court, required intrastate companies to raise their fares to match those permitted by cab. So, fortunately, the ruling was in abeyance because of legal technicalities and may be rendered irrelevant by the regulation of airfares. The ICC illustrates. Let's call it. Not sure what that is. The ICC illustrates what might be called the natural history of government intervention. A real or fancied evil leads to demands to do something about it. A political coalition forms consisting of sincere, high-minded reformers and equally sincere interested parties. The incompatible objectives of the members of the coalition, e.g., low prices to consumers and high prices to producers, are glossed over by fine rhetoric about the public interest, fair competition, and the like. The coalition succeeds in getting Congress or a state legislature to pass a law. The preamble to the law pays lip service to the rhetoric, and the body of the law grants power to government officials to do something. The high-minded reformers experience a glow of triumph and turn their attention to new causes. The interested parties go to work to make sure that the power is used for their benefit. They generally succeed. Success breeds its problems, which are met by broadening the scope of intervention. Bureaucracy takes its toll so that even the initial special interests no longer benefit. In the end, the effects are precisely the opposite of the objectives of the reformers and generally do not even achieve the objectives of the special interest. Yet the activity is so firmly established and so many vested interests are connected with it that repeal of the initial legislation is nearly inconceivable. Instead, new government legislation is called for to cope with the problems produced by the earlier legislation, and a new cycle begins. The ICC reveals clearly each of these steps, from the curious coalition responsible for its establishment to the beginning of a second cycle by the establishment of Amtrak, whose only excuse for existence is that it is largely free from ICC regulations and can therefore do what ICC will not permit the individual railroads to do. The rhetoric, of course, was that the purpose of Amtrak was improved rail passenger transportation. It was supported by railroads because it would permit much then existing passenger service to be eliminated. The excellent and profitable passenger service of the 1930s had deteriorated and become unprofitable as a result of the competition of the airplane and the private car. The ICC would not permit the railroads to curtail the service. Amtrak is now both curtailing it and subsidizing what remains. The ICC had never been established, or if the ICC had never been established, and market forces had been permitted to operate, the United States would today have a far more satisfactory transportation system. The railroad industry would be leaner but more efficient as a result of greater technological innovation under the spur of competition and the more rapid adjustment of routes to the changing demands of traffic. Passenger trains might serve fewer communities, but the facilities and equipment would be far better than they are now, and the service more convenient and rapid. Similarly, there would be more trucking firms, though there might be fewer trucks because of greater efficiency and less waste in such forms as the empty return trips and roundabout routes that ICC regulations now mandate. Costs would be lower and service better. So similarly, there would be more trucking firms, though there might be fewer trucks because of greater efficiency and less waste in such forms as the empty return trips and roundabout routes that ICC regulations now mandate. Costs would be lower and service better. The reader who has had occasion to use an ICC licensed company to move his personal belongings will have no difficulty in accepting that judgment. Though we do not speak from personal experience, we suspect that this is also true for commercial shippers. The whole shape of the transportation industry might be radically different involving perhaps much greater use of combined modes of transport. One of the few profitable private railroad operations in recent years has been a service transporting people plus their automobiles in the same train. Piggyback operation would doubtless have been introduced much sooner than it was, and many other combinations might have emerged. A major argument for letting market forces work is the very difficulty of imagining what the outcome would be. The one thing that is certain is that no service would survive that users did not value highly enough to pay for, and to pay for at prices that yielded the persons providing the service a more adequate income than alternative activities open to them. Neither the users nor the producers would be able to put their hands in anything. Okay, neither the neither the users nor the producers would be able to put their hands in anybody else's pocket to maintain a service that did not satisfy this condition. So an idea just now came into my head, like just now. ICC. Let's go back to the beginning right here. Interstate Commerce Commission. Like, who is this commission? Like, who is it? Like, who are they? Like, why are they so important that they need to be interfering with competition? Like, why? Right? Again, again, this is like, as an American born, I'm and I argue on behalf of the American born, the American born people who are here and don't know anything else but American. I argue on behalf of you guys. So I'm in a place where it's like, I don't like the fact that immigrants are coming here and taking all of our jobs. And they've been doing it for a long time. And I was just a boy. I didn't not know better. But as a future, what's going to happen in the future, bro, for our kids when these immigrants are keeping these jobs that seem as transitional jobs? Like, just go get a job at the local pizza spot, man, as you're going to school. And and now these jobs are being kept for years, bro. And so I'm in a position where, no, I want more regulation. I want us to regulate on these immigrants. And no, no, no. There has to be some like totally different. Like, America has to change its sort of business statement. We need, like, no, no, this is not a place where immigrants come anymore. This is about Americans. And I've been reading lately about, I don't know. I think Trump. We'll see if Trump's just a liar, if he's gonna blow smoke up our ass, which he probably did just to get votes, maybe. Whatever. But then we have to do it ourselves, man. We have to speak up and have these arguments and be willing to say how we feel, not be afraid of what people are gonna think about you or say about you. Honestly.